Hello everyone, again it's Professor Hasselman, and in today's lecture we're going to be talking about the New World and the Old, especially about exploration, from about 1400 to 1650. Now the exploration and the exploitation of Africa and Asia by the Portuguese and of the Americas by first the Spanish, then the French and the English changed the economies, cultures, and political makeup of each of these regions forever. Native civilizations were destroyed, native populations were subjugated, enslaved, and transported from place to place, and often nearly died out. European rulers and merchants gained new sources of wealth, which they used to purchase luxury goods and increase their political and military power. Now, as the Middle Ages came to an end, the Renaissance princes encountered in the last lecture well-educated according to Renaissance principles, ambitious, hard-headed, and ruthless, sought to make themselves more powerful and less beholden to the goodwill of the church, the aristocracy, or their subjects. And to do this, they needed money. One source of funds was the rich trade with the East. Europeans were crazy for fabrics, spices, and medicines from China, India, and the Middle East. Venice, Genoa, Florence, and Milan had grown wealthy on this trade. But after 1453, when the Ottoman Empire conquered Constantinople, anyone wanting Eastern goods had to go through Muslim merchants. In the 15th century, the rulers of Portugal began to seek a way around the Muslims and the Italians. Now, Portugal was relatively a poor country ruled by the House of Aviz. During the reign of King John I, his son, Prince Henry the Navigator, began to explore alternative sources of wealth. In 1419, he founded a college to trade seamen, and he sent successive expeditions down the west coast of Africa, establishing trading posts and looking for a way to turn east. Now, this led to a century of exploration. In 1415, Portuguese mariners captured Ceuta in Morocco, which later was used to capture Tangier. Portuguese mariners explored the Madeira Islands in 1419, the Azores in 1427, Cape Verde by 1444, and Sierra Leone in 1460. In 1482, they founded a major fort at Alima, Ghana, arguably the first European settlement in West Africa. By 1488, Bartholomew Dias reached and rounded the Cape of Good Hope. In 1498, Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape, reached India, and returned with ships laden with the wealth of the East. Now, based on trade with Africa and the East, Portugal became a major seafaring empire. Now, after Columbus laid the foundation for Spanish power in America, the Pope worked out the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. Portugal was awarded everything east of a line 370 miles east of the Cape Verde Islands, and this enabled the Portuguese to claim and colonize Brazil eventually. Under Manuel I, the Portuguese became a naval power, conquering a series of trading posts in and about India. Goa in India in 1510, Malacca in Malaysia in 1511, the Moluccas in present-day Indonesia by 1514, and the island of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf in 1514-15. Now, by the mid-16th century, Portugal began to experience decline, in part because of the attempt to keep up with Spain. Spain kings pressured the Portuguese to expel their Jews and Moors, a mistake that destroyed much of the old Portuguese middle class. In 1536, the King of Portugal introduced the Inquisition. In 1580, the House of Aviz came to an end with the death of Henry I. Philip II of Spain took over, and Spain ruled Portugal for 60 years, known in Portuguese history as the 60 Years' Captivity, with revolts in 1634, 1637, and this one successful in 1640. Now, the greatest influence of Portuguese exploration is that European powers began to emulate it. Now, Spain was also a poor country, only united under Ferdinand and Isabella by the end of the 15th century. This explains why Ferdinand and Isabella supported Christopher Columbus, or Cristoforo Colombo in Italian, or Cristobal Colon in Spanish, when he approached them with a radical way to reach the fabled East: head west. Now, most educated Europeans did not believe the Earth was flat. What this group did not know was how big the Earth was. In fact, Columbus underestimated the distance to Asia. In 1491, the Spanish government agreed to the voyage. With land spotted by lookout Rodrigo de Triana on the 12th of October, 1492, Columbus landed in what is now the Dominican Republic, claiming it for Spain. He returned to Spain, bringing with him exotic natives, parrots, and gold, and was greeted with honors. And the Pope immediately granted Spain the right to the lands discovered by Columbus. Now, Columbus died in 1502, thinking that he had reached the Indies. Now, the Spanish crown soon figured out that it had not reached the East Indies, but a place far more exotic and lucrative. In 1513, Vasco de Balboa discovered the Pacific Ocean. In 1519, the one surviving ship from Ferdinand Magellan's circumnavigation arrived in Spain and reported the vastness of the world. In the same year, Hernán Cortés, or Hernando Cortés, landed in Mexico and conquered an advanced Aztec civilization. In 1531, Francisco Pizarro landed in Peru and did the same thing to the Incas. Now, Spain's discovery of the New World, a totally Eurocentric concept, had momentous consequences for both sides. So what were the consequences for the native peoples? The Indians would mostly die, either in futile resistance or from European diseases to which they had no resistance: smallpox, chickenpox, whooping cough, diphtheria, malaria, measles, yellow-spotted fever, and even the bubonic plague. A population of perhaps 50 million in 1492 would sink to 5 million by 1700. The survivors were enslaved to work the plantations and gold and silver mines of Mexico and Peru. Now, some eventually intermarried with their conquerors, producing new peoples, new mixed peoples. And when the native populations began to die out, both Spain and Portugal began to import slaves culled from Africa. Eventually, some 10 million people were abducted, sold, transported, and worked often to death in the New World. But what were the effects on the Europeans? Intellectually, the European worldview was challenged significantly by the existence of new and different civilizations. Materially, silver in particular flooded into Spain via biannual treasure fleets, making the Spanish crown fabulously wealthy and Spain the dominant power in Europe for nearly 150 years. Now, the wealth bankrolled Charles V's wars to maintain the Holy Roman Empire, and Philip II's to stamp out Protestantism, which we will speak about later this week. But New World silver did nothing for Spanish people, apart from merchants in Seville. Moreover, some historians think that the silver flooding into Europe also destabilized the European economy, leading to unprecedented inflation of about 4% in the 17th century. Nevertheless, other countries noted Spain's quick success and wanted on the bandwagon of exploration, colonization, and exploitation. So let's turn to those other groups now. Unfortunately for France and England, they were too late and too far north to make a quantum leap in wealth or status as a result of American exploration. In the 1580s, the French began to explore and control Canada, the upper Midwest, and the Mississippi Valley. Jesuits established numerous missions, and these settlements did not result in tremendous wealth, but they supplied France with furs and pelts and Grand Banks fishing. France forbade Protestants to settle in Canada. thus eliminating Canada as a social safety valve and limiting the valve of the colonies to the whole of French society. Only in the late 17th century would France aim to exploit its base in North America under the mercantilist policies of Jean-Baptiste Colbert. The English did not really start to think seriously about the Americas until Elizabeth's reign. At first, they just wanted to cash in on Spanish trade, hence the early slaving voyages by John Hawkins in the 1560s. In 1568, Spanish guardacostas attacked an English slaving fleet, which led to a covert war between Spain and England, with English privateers like Hawkins, Sir Francis Drake, and Sir Martin Frobisher seeking to intercept and confiscate Spanish fleets or sack Spanish ports in the New World. Now, the first successful English colony in the Americas was founded at Jamestown in 1607 by a consortium headed by Sir Thomas Smith of the Virginia Company. The purpose of the venture was to mine gold. Now, when no gold was found, the colony discovered a marketable commodity in tobacco, despite the prescient opposition of King James, who wrote a counterblast to tobacco in 1604. In the 1620s, the colony discovered a cheap source of labor in African slaves. Now, the colonization of Massachusetts began with the Plymouth settlement on Cape Cod in 1620 and the Virginia Company Charter. In 1629, the Massachusetts Bay Company was chartered to establish a much larger settlement around Boston, absorbing the Plymouth settlement in 1691. Now, the Massachusetts Bay Company allowed for a self-government, and its leaders consciously set out to found a Puritan New Jerusalem, a city on a hill, where Puritan liturgy, morality, and social conventions could be enforced, free from the persecution of the English Church. Now, Massachusetts Bay colonists who came for economic opportunity chafed under the intolerant religious regime. Rather, these settlements existed to provide a refuge for those Puritans who could not conform to the Church of England. Now, Puritan intolerance eventually drove a Salem clergyman named Roger Williams to found Rhode Island as a haven for a wider variety of Protestants as well as Jews. In 1632, George Calvert, Lord Baltimore, a Catholic, founded Maryland, which eventually became a haven for Catholics. In the end, the English colonies of the New World provided limited commercial or military value. These colonies were an increasingly important safety valve for those people who could neither abide nor prosper in Anglican village society. They provided an alternative to the poor law for indigent Englishmen. The English government also sought to encourage the development of other markets for English products. The English had only wool to export. Of the several monopolistic trading companies chartered between 1555 and 1600, only the British East India Company, which was a joint stock company in which profit and loss were shared among all who cared to invest, had the potential to benefit a wider swath of English society. Now, after the Dutch massacred an English trading colony in Amboina in the Moluccas in 1623, all East India companies, the French, the Dutch, and the English, fought literal trade wars for the trade of the Far East. Now, by the 17th century, they armed their ships as men of war, fielded vast armies against each other, and used their armies to intimidate local rulers into acceptance of their trade. Now, the great trading nation in the 17th century was increasingly the Dutch. In the 1560s, the Dutch began a long insurgency against Spain for the independence, which Spain granted in a truce of 1609, though full independence as a separate country wasn't recognized until the Treaty of Münster in 1648. The Dutch founded a republic, a confederation of self-governing provinces, sending representatives to a legislative body called the States General, with an executive officer, sometimes called elected, called a stadholder, or stadholder in Dutch. The last important venture was to Java in 1600, when there was a series of trading voyages establishing trading posts in Africa, Tasmania, and the Cape of Good Hope, and especially in the Far East. Now, the Dutch East India Company, chartered in 1602, established trading colonies in the Moluccas, or Spice Islands, and in 1619 founded Batavia, now Jakarta, in western Java. A Dutch West India Company established in 1621 sponsors colonies in the West Indies at Curaçao and later Saint Martin. North America at New Amsterdam in 1624, and Pernambuco, Brazil, in 1630. In 1654, the Portuguese drove the Dutch from Brazil, and in 1664, the Dutch lost New Amsterdam to the British, who named it New York. Now, the Holy Roman Empire never engaged in the exploration game and never acquired any major overseas trade or colonies that it could exploit. So why is this? Perhaps, once again, geography is destiny. The Holy Roman Empire was badly placed for either Eastern or Western trade. Or was it a lack of will? After all, North Germans had always been distinguished sailors. Was it the close connection with Spain, seeming to absolve the German ruler of the duty to try? The failure of the Germans to engage in the great game of European imperialism until the 19th century had far-reaching consequences: imperial poverty, powerlessness, and Protestantism. The Holy Roman Emperor never figured out a financial mechanism to pay his armies beyond taxation and consulting the Diet, or the representatives, the government parliament representatives. As a partial result, the emperor remained the weakest of the great European rulers, the elected chairman of a board of some 300 kingdoms, duchies, counties, and dioceses. This will go a long way to explain why the topic of the next lecture, the Protestant Reformation, could happen in only one place: the Holy Roman Empire.